Sometimes a man reaches an age where the past won't let him rest. Cole Mathers knew that feeling better than most, carrying 30 years of regret in his chest like a stone that wouldn't dissolve. At 62, he returned to Bitterroot County, with nothing but a limping cattle dog named Whiskey and $2 in his pocket. The townsfolk laughed when he bought the abandoned homestead at a tax auction, just a rotting shack from the old mining days. But Cole remembered something they didn't. A dying outlaw had once whispered to him about secrets buried in those hills. When Whiskey started digging near the old root cellar, everything changed. What they found connected Cole to the father he never knew, and a treasure that had been waiting decades to surface. Could this broken-down man finally find the redemption he'd been searching for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The pickup truck wheezed to a stop in front of what could generously be called a homestead, though disaster might have been more accurate. Cole Mathers stepped out slowly, his joints protesting the 3-hour drive from Billings. Whiskey jumped down beside him with considerably more enthusiasm than his arthritic hips should have allowed, immediately beginning his inspection of their new domain. The Montana afternoon sun cast long shadows across the property, highlighting every broken, bored and sagging beam of the structure that had cost Cole his last $2. The main building, calling it a house would be charitable, leaned to one side like an old drunk trying to find his balance. Moss had claimed the north-facing wall, and what remained of the roof looked like Swiss cheese after decades of hail and neglect. But Cole wasn't looking at the decay. He was seeing possibility, the way a sculptor sees David in a block of marble. This place had bones, good bones, even if the flesh had rotted away. The foundation stones were solid, quarried from local granite that would outlast them all. The timber, what wasn't completely gone, was old-growth pine that they didn't make anymore. "What do you think, boy?" Cole asked, scratching behind Whiskey's ears. The dog's tail wagged once, then he trotted off to investigate a particularly interesting scent near what used to be a vegetable garden. Cole pulled the yellow deed from his jacket pocket, unfolding it carefully. The paper felt fragile between his weathered fingers, like it might crumble at any moment. According to the county records, this land had been homesteaded in 1889 by a family named Henderson. They'd worked it for 30 years before the Great Depression drove them out. After that, the ownership got murky. The deed showed a gap from 1943 to 1947, 4 years where the property seemed to exist in legal limbo. That gap nagged at Cole. In his experience, things didn't just disappear from public records without reason. Someone had wanted this place forgotten during those war years. He walked the perimeter of the main building, noting where repairs were most urgently needed. The porch steps had rotted through completely. He'd need to rebuild those first if he wanted to get inside without breaking his neck. The windows were mostly intact, though the glass was so dirty it looked like looking through muddy water. Behind the house, he found the remnants of what had once been a thriving operation. A barn that was more air than structure, a chicken coop that looked like it had been used for target practice, and beyond that, an old root cellar built into the hillside. The heavy wooden door hung askew on its hinges, revealing nothing but darkness within. Whiskey had found something interesting near the cellar. The dog was pawing at the ground with unusual intensity, whining softly, a sound Cole had learned to pay attention to over their 7 years together. "What is it, Whiskey?" Cole approached slowly. The dog had always been peculiar about certain smells and sounds, but this was different. This was focused, almost urgent. The ground near the cellar showed signs of previous disturbance, though not recent. Someone had dug here before, maybe years ago, filling it back in without much care for how it looked. Cole made a mental note to investigate later when he had proper tools and better light. The late afternoon sun painted the surrounding hills in shades of gold and amber. This was God's country, no doubt about it. Rolling mountains stretched in every direction, covered in pine and aspen that would turn brilliant yellow come fall. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, its water clear and cold even in the heat of summer. Cole had grown up in country like this, 200 miles south in the Beartooth Mountains. His mother had raised him alone on a failing ranch, never talking much about his father, except to say he'd been a good man who made hard choices. Cole had always wondered what that meant, but she'd taken those secrets to her grave 15 years ago. It wasn't until he was serving time in Deer Lodge State Prison that he'd gotten any real clues about his past. That's where he'd met Bone McGrath, a career criminal dying slowly of lung cancer in the prison infirmary. Bone had taken a liking to Cole, maybe because they were both Montana boys who'd ended up on the wrong side of the law. "You got the look of someone I used to know," Bone had wheezed during one of their conversations. "What was your daddy's name?" "Boy, James Mathers," Cole had replied. "Though I never knew him. Died before I was born, or so my mother said." Bone's eyes had gone wide at that name, and he'd gripped Cole's arm with surprising strength for a dying man. "James Mathers, I'll be damned. You're Jimmy's boy. You knew my father?" "Knew him? Hell, I worked with him. Up in Bitterroot County, back in 43 and 44, we were—" Bone had paused, looking around the infirmary to make sure no one was listening. "We were moving things. Valuable things. Your daddy, he had a place up there, hidden away in the hills." Bone had described the location in detail. The creek, the old mine workings, the way the mountains formed a natural bowl around the valley. But it was his final words that had haunted Cole through the remaining 8 years of his sentence. "There's more buried up there than bones, boy. Your daddy made sure of that before he disappeared." Cole had spent those 8 years thinking about Bone's words, wondering if the old criminal was telling the truth or just spinning tales to pass the time. It wasn't until he got out and started researching property records that he'd found this place. The description matched perfectly, right down to the creek and the old mine entrance visible on the far hillside. The $2 price tag at the tax auction had seemed too good to be true. Properties in Montana, even run-down ones, usually went for thousands. But apparently, the combination of legal complications and the property's remote location had scared off most buyers. Cole had been the only bidder. Now, standing on land that might have belonged to his father, Cole felt a mixture of hope and dread. Hope that he might finally learn something about the man who'd given him life, but never a chance to know him. Dread that whatever secrets this place held might be better left buried. The sound of a vehicle approaching broke his reverie. Cole looked up to see a dust cloud on the access road, getting bigger as whatever was making it got closer. Out here, unexpected. Visitors were rarely good news. A battered Ford pickup crested the hill and pulled up beside Cole's truck. The driver was a woman, maybe 55, with graying brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore work clothes, jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. But her eyes were sharp and intelligent, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd earned her place in the world. "You must be the fool who bought this place," she said, climbing out of her truck. There was no malice in her voice, just statement of fact. "That would be me," Cole replied. "Cole Mathers." The woman extended her hand. "Martha Brennan. I run the general store in Copper Falls. Heard someone had finally bought the old Henderson place." Her handshake was firm, calloused from years of hard work. Cole liked that. Too many people these days had soft hands and softer spines. "Copper Falls is the nearest town?" "Only town within 30 miles, Martha said, looking around the property with the eye of someone who'd seen it in better days. "Population 400 and change, depending on who's in jail and who's moved away looking for work." "What can you tell me about this place?" Martha's expression grew careful. "Depends what you want to know. The Hendersons were good people. Worked this land hard until the Depression broke them like it broke everybody else. After that," she shrugged, "different people came and went. None stayed long. The deed shows a gap in ownership during the war years." "Does it?" Martha's tone was neutral, but Cole caught something in her eyes. Recognition, maybe, or warning. Well, the war was a strange time. Lots of things happened that don't make much sense looking back. Before Cole could ask more questions, Whiskey started barking. The dog was back near the root cellar, pawing at the ground with even more intensity than before. His barks had an urgent quality that Cole had never heard before. "That your dog?" Martha asked. "Whiskey. He's usually pretty calm, but something's got him worked up." Martha walked over to where the dog was digging, her expression growing more serious with each step. When she reached the spot, she knelt down and examined the disturbed earth. "Interesting," she said, standing and brushing dirt off her knees. "This ground's been turned before. Not recently, but not too long ago either." "How can you tell? Lived here all my life. You learn to read the land like a book." She looked at Cole with new interest. "What did you say your last name was?" "Mathers. Cole Mathers." Something changed in Martha's face. The careful neutrality was replaced by genuine surprise and maybe a little fear. "Mathers," she repeated. "Well, I'll be damned. After all these years. You knew someone named Mathers?" Martha glanced around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening, then moved closer to Cole. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Your daddy. I was just a kid then, maybe 12 or 13, but I remember. James Mathers. He used to come through town now and then, always with different people, always looking over his shoulder." Cole's heart rate picked up. "You knew my father?" "Knew of him. My daddy ran the store back then, same as I do now. James would come in for supplies, food, ammunition, mining equipment, always paid in cash, always in a hurry." "What happened to him?" Martha shook her head. "Nobody knows for sure. One day he was there, next day he wasn't. Some folks said he got caught in a mine cave-in. Others thought he'd run off to avoid some kind of trouble. But I'll tell you one thing, there were a lot of people asking questions about James Mathers after he disappeared. Federal people. The sun was getting low, casting long shadows across the valley. Martha glanced at her watch and frowned. "I should get going. Store doesn't run itself." She headed back to her truck, then paused. "Bit of advice, Cole. This is a small community. People talk and word travels fast. Might want to be careful who you trust with questions about your daddy." She drove away, leaving Cole alone with his thoughts and an increasingly agitated dog. Whiskey had given up digging and was now circling the area near the root cellar, whining softly. Cole walked over and knelt where the dog had been pawing. The earth was definitely disturbed, forming a rough rectangle about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. Someone had buried something here, and not too carefully. As he stood, Cole noticed something else. The door to the root cellar wasn't just hanging crooked, it had been forced. The wood around the hinges showed fresh gouges, as if someone had pried it open with a crowbar or similar tool. A chill ran down Cole's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Someone else had been here recently. Someone else was looking for whatever his father might have left behind. The question was, had they found it? Cole spent the night in his truck, wrapped in a sleeping bag that had seen better decades. The mountain air was thin and cold, even in summer, and every hour brought new sounds from the darkness around the homestead. Whiskey alternated between sleeping fitfully and padding restlessly around the property, always returning to that spot near the root cellar. When dawn broke over the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of rose and gold, Cole felt like he'd barely slept. But the morning light brought clarity to decisions that had seemed impossible in the darkness. Whatever was buried on this property, whatever secrets his father had left behind, Cole was going to find them. He drove into Copper Falls for supplies, returning with a pickup bed full of basic tools, canned goods, and enough lumber to make the homestead barely habitable. The town had watched him, with the polite interest small communities reserved for outsiders, but Cole caught the subtle glances and whispered conversations that followed in his wake. By noon, he'd managed to replace the rotted porch steps and clear enough debris from the main room to set up a basic camp. The house had good bones, just as he'd thought. Someone had built this place to last, with hand-hewn timbers and mortise and tenon joints that had held for over a century, but it was Whiskey's behavior that dominated his attention. The dog had spent the entire morning focused on that same patch of disturbed ground, occasionally digging, but mostly just staring at it with an intensity that was almost unsettling. "All right, boy," Cole said, setting down his hammer. "Let's see what's got you so worked up." He fetched a shovel from his supplies and walked over to where Whiskey waited. The dog's tail wagged once, as if to say, "Finally," then sat back to supervise. The ground was softer than Cole had expected, the soil loose and sandy rather than the packed clay he'd encountered elsewhere on the property. Someone had definitely been here before, and recently enough that the earth hadn't had time to fully settle. 3 feet down, the shovel hit something with a metallic clank. Cole's pulse quickened. He dropped to his knees and began clearing away dirt with his hands, working carefully around whatever lay buried. Within minutes, he'd exposed the corner of a rusted tobacco tin, the kind that used to hold pipe tobacco back when such things were common. The tin came free with gentle persistence, about the size of a paperback book, but heavier than he'd expected. The lid was sealed tight with corrosion, but Cole could see something rattling inside when he shook it. He carried the tin to his truck and worked at the lid with a knife until it finally popped free. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth, were 2 items that made his breath catch in his throat. The first was a photograph, faded and yellowed, but still clear enough to make out details. It showed a man in his 30s, tall and lean, with dark hair and eyes that looked remarkably familiar when Cole caught his reflection in the truck's side mirror. The man wore work clothes and stood next to what looked like the very homestead Cole now owned, but in much better condition. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "James Mathers, summer 1943. Cole stared at the image for a long time, trying to reconcile this face with the absence that had shaped his entire life. His father had been real, had stood on this very ground, had looked out at these same mountains. The knowledge hit him like a physical blow. The second item in the tin was even more intriguing, a piece of paper that had once been larger but was now torn along one edge. It appeared to be part of a map, showing hand-drawn landmarks and what looked like distances marked in paces. Most of the writing was too faded to read, but Cole could make out a few words. Creek, mine, and something that might have been 30 paces north. The torn edge suggested this was only part of a larger map. Someone had deliberately divided it, keeping the pieces separate for security. But why? Cole was so absorbed in studying the map fragment that he almost didn't notice the approaching vehicle. A black SUV was making its way up the access road, moving faster than Martha's truck had the day before. This wasn't a social visit. 2 men got out when the SUV stopped. Both wore khaki pants and polo shirts that screamed, trying too hard to look casual. The driver was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair, while his passenger was shorter but built like a linebacker. Neither man looked like they belonged in rural Montana. "Mr. Mathers?" The tall one approached with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm David Chen, and this is my associate, Mr. Burke. We represent certain interested parties regarding this property." Cole slipped the photograph and map fragment into his jacket pocket, trying to look casual. "What kind of interested parties?" "Historical. Preservation groups, mainly. We understand this land has significant heritage value, particularly relating to World War II activities." Burke remained by the SUV, his eyes constantly scanning the property. Everything about him suggested military or law enforcement training, from his posture to the way he positioned himself to maintain clear sight lines. "I just bought this place," Cole said carefully. "Don't know much about its history." Chen's smile widened, becoming even less convincing. "Oh, but we think you do, Mr. Mathers. Your family name carries considerable historical significance in this area. We'd be very interested in discussing any artifacts or documents that might have been left behind by previous owners." The way he said artifacts made Cole's skin crawl. These men weren't historians or preservationists. They were treasure hunters, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. Like I said, I just got here. Haven't found anything interesting yet. Of course not, Chen agreed smoothly. But if you should happen to discover anything, old papers, maps, personal effects, we'd be prepared to make a very generous offer. Historical preservation pays well for the right kind of cooperation. Burke spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a faint accent that Cole couldn't place. Sometimes old secrets are better left buried, yes? Safer for everyone involved. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Cole's hand moved instinctively toward his jacket pocket, where the photograph and map fragment seemed to burn against his chest. "I'll keep that in mind," Cole said. "You do that." Chen handed him a business card that looked legitimate, but probably wasn't. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Mathers. This area can be dangerous for people who don't know its history. Easy to get lost in these mountains or have accidents around old mine shafts." They drove away as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving Cole standing alone with whiskey. The dog had growled softly throughout the encounter, staying close to Cole's. "Legs. Good instincts, boy," Cole murmured, scratching the dog's ears. "I don't trust them either." But their visit had confirmed what Cole was beginning to suspect. Whatever his father had been involved in, whatever he'd hidden on this property, other people knew about it, and they were willing to use threats to get it. Cole spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about the map fragment, trying to match its crude landmarks to features on the property. The creek was obvious. It ran along the eastern boundary, just as shown on the paper. The mine entrance was visible on the hillside, about half a mile north of the homestead. But the other markings were harder to interpret. As the sun began to set, Cole made his decision. He wasn't going to be intimidated by suits in fancy cars, and he wasn't going to let whatever his father had died protecting fall into the wrong. In hands. Tomorrow he would start following the map, but first he needed to know more about what he was getting into. The photograph had raised as many questions as it answered, and the map fragment was clearly incomplete. If he was going to survive whatever game he'd stumbled into, he needed more information. That evening, as he sat on the rebuilt porch with whiskey at his feet, Cole pulled out his phone and called Martha's store. Her voice was cautious when she realized who was calling. "Cole, everything all right up there?" "Had some visitors today, men asking questions about the property's history. They seem to know more about my father than I do." There was a long pause before Martha responded. "What kind of men?" "The kind who make threats while pretending to be helpful." "Jesus." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "Listen to me carefully, Cole. Meet me at the store tomorrow morning, early, 7 o'clock, before I open. There are things you need to know, things I should have told you yesterday." "What kind of things?" "The kind that got your father killed, and might get you killed too if you're not careful. And Cole, don't trust anyone else until we've talked. Not the sheriff, not any other strangers who come calling. Nobody." The line went dead, leaving Cole alone with his thoughts and a growing sense that he'd stepped into something much larger and more dangerous than he'd imagined. The photograph of his father seemed to watch him from where he'd propped it against a lamp, and the torn map fragment felt like a puzzle piece to a picture he might not want to see completed. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called from the pine trees, its voice echoing across the valley like a warning. Cole pulled his jacket tighter and tried to convince himself that tomorrow would bring answers instead of more questions. But deep down, he knew that whatever secrets this land held, they were about to change his life forever. The only question was whether he'd survive the discovery. Cole arrived at Martha's store just as the first light of dawn was creeping over the eastern mountains. The building sat at the heart of Copper Falls' three-block Main Street, a weathered, wooden structure that looked like it had been built sometime around the turn of the century. A hand-painted sign reading Brennan's General Store hung above a covered porch where local men probably gathered to discuss weather and politics. Martha was waiting for him, coffee already brewing in a pot that looked older than both of them combined. She moved with nervous energy, constantly glancing out the windows as if expecting unwelcome visitors. "Sit down," she said, pouring 2 cups of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. "We need to talk about your father, and it's not a conversation." "I ever thought I'd be having—" Cole settled into a chair behind the counter, accepting the coffee gratefully. The morning air was sharp with the promise of winter, even though summer was barely half over in the high country. "Tell me what you know," Martha said. "All of it." Cole pulled out the photograph and map fragment, laying them on the counter between. "Them." Martha's face went pale when she saw the picture. "Dear God," she whispered, "you look just like him. Same eyes, same stubborn jaw." She picked up the photograph with trembling fingers. "I haven't seen this face in almost 40 years. "What was he involved in, Martha? Those men yesterday, they knew something. They weren't historians." Martha stood and walked to the front door, checking the lock and pulling down a shade that read "closed" on the outside. When she returned, she was carrying a shoebox that looked like it had been hidden under the counter. "Your father wasn't." "Just passing through Copper Falls," she began, opening the box to reveal a collection of old papers, newspaper clippings, and photographs. "He lived here for almost 2 years, from late 1942 until he disappeared in the summer of 1944. She pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping from the Copper Falls Gazette, dated August 15th, 1943. The headline read, "Local mining operations support war effort." During the war, this area was crawling with activity, Martha explained. The government reopened old copper and silver mines, brought in equipment and workers. Officially, they were mining materials needed for the war effort. Unofficially, she trailed off, sifting through the papers until she found what she was looking for. It was a letter, written on official letterhead from the Department of the Interior. The writing was faded, but Cole could make out enough to understand its significance. "Dear Mr. Brennan," the letter began, "your cooperation in the current mining assessment project is appreciated by the federal government. As discussed, absolute discretion regarding the nature of materials being extracted is essential to national security." Martha's father had kept the letter for nearly 8 decades. "The mines weren't just producing copper," Martha said quietly. "There were rumors, whispers about other things being brought up from underground. Valuable things that didn't belong in Montana mine shafts." Cole studied the map fragment again, comparing it to his memory of the property. "You think my father was involved in hiding something from those mining operations?" "I think your father was trying to protect something. The question is what, and from whom?" Martha pulled out another item from the shoebox, a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Cole's heart stopped when he recognized the handwriting on the envelopes. It was the same careful script he'd seen on the back of the photograph. "These came to the store," Martha explained. "My father was the unofficial postmaster back then. Your father asked him to hold these letters, said he'd pick them up when things settled down. He never came back for them. No, he never did." Cole untied the ribbon with careful fingers, his hands shaking slightly. There were 5 letters in total, all addressed to Sarah Mathers, General Delivery, Livingston, Montana. His mother's name, his mother's town. "He wrote to her," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every week for 2 months, then nothing. My father waited 6 months before opening them, trying to figure out if they should be forwarded. But by then, Sarah had moved away without leaving an address." Cole opened the first letter, dated March 12, 1944. His father's handwriting was strong and clear, the words chosen carefully. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "I know you're angry about my leaving, and you have every right to be. But what I'm doing here is important, more important than I can explain in a letter. I'm trying to secure a future for our son, trying to make sure he inherits something more than just my mistakes." Cole's throat tightened. His son. His father had known about him. The letter continued. "The work here is dangerous, but it's necessary. There are people who would use what we've found for terrible purposes. I can't let that happen. If something happens to me, look for the key. It will lead you to everything you need to know." The key. Cole looked up at Martha. What key? Martha shook her head. I don't know, but there's more. Cole opened the second letter, dated a week later. This one was more urgent, the handwriting. Less careful. Sarah, I need you to listen carefully. If anything happens to me, take our boy and leave Montana. Go somewhere they can't find you. Trust no one from the government, no matter what badges they show or promises they make. What we've discovered here is worth killing for, and these people won't hesitate to do exactly that. The third letter was even more desperate. James Mathers had been scared, Cole realized. Genuinely terrified of something. They know I'm onto them. 3 men came asking questions yesterday, claiming to be federal inspectors, but I've seen their type before in Europe. They're not Americans, Sarah. I think they're the same people who were working with the prisoners at the camp. Prisoners? Cole looked up sharply. What prisoners? Martha pulled out another newspaper clipping, this one from 1943. The headline read, German POWs assist local mining operations. There was a prisoner of war camp about 20 miles north of here, she explained. German soldiers captured in North Africa. The government used them as labor in the mines. Officially, it was all above board. Unofficially, some of those prisoners weren't regular soldiers. Cole felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What do you mean, SS? Officers, war criminals. People who should have been in maximum security facilities, not working in Montana mine shafts. My father always said there was something wrong about the whole operation, but nobody wanted to ask too many questions during wartime. The fourth letter from his father painted an even darker picture. I found out what they were really mining, Sarah. It's not just copper and silver. There's a chamber deep in the main shaft, sealed off from the regular operations. The Germans know exactly where to dig, like they had maps of the tunnels that shouldn't exist. They're pulling up things that were hidden here during the war. Gold, jewelry, artifacts, Nazi treasure, Sarah. Millions of dollars worth. Cole's hands trembled as he read the final letter, dated just 3 days before his father's disappearance. This is my last letter, my love. They're planning to kill me tonight. I've hidden what I could, marked the locations on a map. I've divided the map into 3 pieces and hidden them separately. If you find them, if our boy ever needs them, they'll lead to enough evidence to expose this whole conspiracy. Look for the key, Sarah. It opens more than just locks. It opens the truth. The letter was signed simply, All my love, James. Cole sat back in his chair, overwhelmed by the flood of information. His father hadn't been a criminal or an outlaw, as Cole had always assumed. He'd been trying to expose a conspiracy involving Nazi war criminals and stolen treasure. The men who visited you yesterday, Martha said quietly. Did one of them have an accent? Cole nodded. European, maybe. German. Then they're still here, still looking for whatever your father hid. Martha began putting the letters back in the shoebox. And now they know you're James Mathers' son. What happened to my father, really? Martha's expression grew grim. The official story was a mining accident. Cave-in trapped him in a shaft. Body never recovered. But there were people in town who saw him that night, hours after he was supposed to be dead. And there were strangers, asking questions for months afterward, offering money for information about James Mathers. Cole stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet main street. Somewhere out there, people were still hunting for his father's secrets. And now they knew he existed. There's something else, Martha said. Something I should have told. You yesterday. Cole turned back to face her. Your father wasn't the only one. There were 3 men working together, trying to expose the conspiracy. The other 2 disappeared within a week of each other, right after James vanished. Who were they? One was a federal agent named William Daniels. The other was my cousin, David Brennan. Martha's voice cracked slightly. David was only 22 years old. He was going to marry the Henderson girl, Emma, whose family used to own your property. The pieces were starting to come together, forming a picture that was both clearer and more terrifying than Cole had imagined. His father had died, protecting something valuable enough to kill for, And nearly 40 years later, the same people were still looking for it. "Martha," Cole said carefully, "is William Daniels related to anyone still living in this area?" "He had a son, Samuel Daniels. He's the sheriff now." Cole felt the ground shift beneath him. The local sheriff was the son of one of his father's partners. That could be very good news or very bad news, depending on which side of the conspiracy sheriff Daniels had chosen. "I need to see him," Cole said. Martha shook her head vigorously. "Not yet. We don't know if we can trust him. His father died trying to help yours, but that doesn't mean the son inherited the same loyalties." "Then what do you suggest?" "Go back to your property. Study that map fragment. Look for the other pieces your father mentioned in his letters. But be careful, Cole. These people have waited almost 40 years to get their hands on whatever your father hid. They're not going to give up now." As Cole prepared to leave, Martha grabbed his arm. "There's one more thing. The key your father mentioned in his letters? I think I might know what it is." Martha disappeared into the back room of the store, returning with something wrapped in an old flour sack. She set it carefully on the counter and unwrapped it to reveal what looked like an ordinary brass compass, though clearly antique and well used. "This showed up at the store 3 days after your father disappeared," she said. "Wrapped in brown paper, no note, no return address. My father kept it all these years, thinking someone might come asking for it." Cole picked up the compass with reverent hands. The brass was tarnished with age, but the craftsmanship was excellent. On the back, engraved in flowing script, were the initials J.M. and a date, 1943. "James Mathers," Cole whispered. "That's what we always assumed, but look closer at the face." Cole opened the compass and immediately saw what Martha meant. Instead of pointing to magnetic north, the needle pointed consistently to the northwest, no matter which way Cole turned. Someone had modified the compass, adjusting the internal mechanism to point towards something specific. "It's not measuring magnetic north," Cole realized. "It's pointing to a fixed location. Your father was clever. He knew someone might search him, might take obvious maps or documents, but who would think twice about a broken compass?" Cole slipped the compass into his jacket pocket alongside the photograph and map fragment. The weight of it felt significant, like a piece of his father's presence finally returned to him. "There's something else you need to know," Martha continued. "The mine where your father supposedly died. It's on your property. The main entrance is about half a mile from your homestead up in the hills." Cole remembered seeing the dark opening in the mountainside when he'd first surveyed his land. At the time, he'd dismissed it as just another abandoned hole in the ground, a relic of Montana's mining boom days. "Is it safe to explore?" Martha's expression grew troubled. "I don't know. Nobody's been inside for decades, at least not openly. But I've heard rumors over the years, sounds coming from up there at night, lights moving around where no lights should be." Cole left the store with more questions than answers, but also with concrete evidence that his father had been involved in something far bigger than a simple mining operation. The modified compass felt warm in his pocket, like it was eager to fulfill its purpose after nearly 4 decades of waiting. The drive back to the homestead gave him time to think. If his father had hidden evidence of a Nazi conspiracy, if there really was stolen treasure buried somewhere on the property, then Cole wasn't just inheriting land, he was inheriting a responsibility. James Mathers had died trying to expose war criminals and recover stolen goods. The least his son could do was finish what he'd started. But first, Cole needed to understand what he was dealing with. The compass pointed northwest, roughly in the direction of the mine entrance. The map fragment showed landmarks that matched features on his property. Somewhere among these clues lay the location of whatever his father had died protecting. Back at the homestead, Cole found whiskey exactly where he'd left him, sitting near the spot where they'd found the tobacco tin, staring at the ground with unwavering attention. The dog's behavior was becoming increasingly strange, as if he could sense things that remained hidden from human perception. "What is it, boy?" Cole knelt beside the dog, scratching behind his ears. "You know there's more. Down there, don't you?" He spent the afternoon exploring the property more systematically, using the compass to guide his search. The needle remained steady, pointing toward the mine entrance with mechanical precision. But as Cole walked the land, he began to notice other things, subtle signs that someone had been here recently, boot prints in the soft earth near the creek, too fresh to be from previous owners or casual hikers. Broken branches at shoulder height, as if someone had pushed through the undergrowth without caring about noise or concealment. Most disturbing, tire tracks near the tree line that didn't match his own truck or Martha's old Ford. Chen and Burke had been here, probably more than once. The realization made Cole's skin crawl. While he'd been sleeping in town or driving back and forth to Copper Falls, strangers had been roaming his property, searching for the same secrets that had gotten his father killed. The question was, what had they found? Cole followed the compass, bearing toward the mine, climbing through pine forest and over rocky outcroppings that probably hadn't felt human footsteps in years. The air grew cooler as he gained elevation, and the sounds of civilization faded until all he could hear was wind in the trees and his own breathing. The mine entrance was larger than it had appeared from a distance. A rectangular opening about 8 feet high and 6 feet wide, carved into the living rock of the mountainside. Railroad tracks emerged from the darkness, their steel rails rusted but still visible under decades of accumulated debris. Someone had been here recently, very recently. Fresh footprints in the dirt, cigarette butts that weren't weathered by more than a few days of mountain air, and most tellingly, new scratches on the rocks around the entrance where someone had used metal tools to clear away vegetation. Cole wished he'd brought a flashlight, but the late afternoon sun provided enough illumination to see about 20 feet into the tunnel. The walls were reinforced with timber supports, and side passages branched off into deeper darkness. This wasn't just a simple mine, it was an extensive underground network. Near the entrance, almost hidden under a pile of rocks that had been carefully arranged to look natural, Cole found something that made his blood run cold. It was a leather portfolio, the kind used to carry important documents. The leather was water-stained and cracked with age, but still intact. Inside the portfolio, Cole discovered papers that confirmed his worst fears. Mining reports dated 1943 and 1944, written in English but signed with German names. Inventory lists, detailing quantities of gold, silver, and miscellaneous artifacts that had been relocated to secure storage. Maps showing the underground tunnel system, with specific chambers marked as Special Storage A through Special Storage E. But it was the final document that made Cole's hands shake. A typed report on official Wehrmacht letterhead, dated July 15th, 1944, just days before his father's disappearance. "Security breach confirmed," the report began. "Subject J. Mathers has accessed restricted areas and may have photographed sensitive materials. Recommend immediate termination to preserve operational integrity." The report was signed by someone called Oberfuhrer K. Wagner, Special Operations Division. Cole sank down onto a boulder, overwhelmed by the implications. His father hadn't just stumbled onto a conspiracy. He'd been systematically investigating it, gathering evidence, preparing to expose Nazi war criminals who were using American mining operations to hide stolen treasure, and they'd killed him. And for it, the sound of an approaching vehicle broke Cole's concentration. Through the trees below, he could see a dust cloud moving up the access road toward his homestead. Someone was coming, and after finding the Wehrmacht document, Cole doubted. It was a friendly visit. He stuffed the portfolio inside his jacket and started down the mountainside, moving as quickly as the terrain allowed. Halfway to the house, he could see the vehicle clearly, the same black SUV from the day before, parked next to his truck. Chen and Burke were back, and they weren't alone. A third man stood beside the SUV, older than the other two, and carrying himself with military bearing. Even at a distance, Cole could see the man was scanning the property with professional thoroughness, noting defensive positions and escape routes. Cole circled wide, using the forest for cover until he could approach the homestead from the east. Whiskey was nowhere to be seen, which worried Cole more than the presence of the strangers. The dog had excellent instincts about danger. From his concealed position, Cole could hear voices carrying on the mountain air. Definitely been inside. "The mine," the older man was saying. His accent was thick, unmistakably German. "Fresh tracks, disturbed areas. He knows more than he's telling us." "Should we wait for him?" That was Burke's voice. "No. We search the property now. Take whatever we find. If Mathers returns while we're here, we'll have a conversation about family loyalty." Cole's blood ran cold. These weren't just treasure hunters. They were descendants of the same Nazi conspiracy his father had died fighting, and they were planning to search his property whether he cooperated or not. He needed help, and he needed it fast. But who could he trust? Martha had warned him against contacting the sheriff, and there was no way to know if Sheriff Daniels was friend or foe. As Cole wrestled with his options, Whiskey appeared beside him as silently as smoke, panting softly, but alert. The dog's presence was reassuring, but it also reminded Cole that he wasn't just responsible for his own safety anymore. The three men were walking toward the homestead, spreading out in a pattern that suggested military training. They moved with purpose, checking corners and maintaining clear lines of sight. These weren't amateurs. Cole made his decision. He couldn't face three armed men alone, especially not without knowing their full intentions. The smart move was to retreat, gather more information, and plan a proper response. But as he prepared to withdraw deeper into the forest, one of the men called out in a voice that carried across the valley. "Mr. Mathers, we know you're out there. We're not here to hurt you, we just want to talk. There are things about your father you need to understand, things that might change your perspective on this whole situation." The older German's voice was cultured, almost professorial. "Your father was not the hero you think he was, Mr. Mathers. He stole something that belonged to us, something we've spent decades trying to recover. We're willing to negotiate, to offer you compensation for your cooperation." Cole remained hidden, but his mind was racing. What if they were telling the truth? What if his father had been a thief rather than a hero? The letters to his mother suggested James Mathers had been trying to expose a conspiracy. But what if those letters were lies, justifications for criminal behavior? Then Cole remembered the Wehrmacht document in his jacket, the cold calculation, in the order for his father's termination. Whatever James Mathers had done, whatever he'd taken, the Nazis had been willing to kill for it. That suggested the stakes were much higher than simple theft. "We'll wait until dark," the German continued. "Then we'll search the property properly. If you're smart, Mr. Mathers, you'll come talk to us before then." Things could go much easier for everyone involved. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, Cole realized he was running out of time and options. He needed allies, and he needed them tonight. The modified compass in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as if his father's spirit was urging him toward a decision that could change everything. The question was, did Cole have the courage to follow in his father's footsteps, even knowing where that path had led? Cole waited until full darkness before making his move. The three men had set up what looked like a professional surveillance operation, with one person maintaining watch while the others searched the property with military precision. They had equipment, night vision goggles, metal detectors, communications gear that suggested this was far more than a casual treasure hunt. Moving through the forest with Whiskey at his side, Cole worked his way toward the old root cellar. If his father had hidden additional clues on the property, the cellar seemed like the most likely location. It was the one place Whiskey had consistently shown interest, and it had clearly been searched before, though perhaps not thoroughly. Enough, The cellar door hung open, revealing darkness that seemed to swallow the faint starlight. Cole had brought a small flashlight this time, but he kept it switched off until he was certain the light wouldn't be visible from the house. Inside, the cellar was larger than it appeared from outside, carved directly into the hillside with the same careful stonework that characterized the homestead's foundation. Shelves lined the walls, most of them empty or holding the remnants of decades-old preserves, but in the back corner, Cole's flashlight beam revealed something that made his pulse quicken. Someone had been digging here recently, very recently. Fresh. Earth was piled beside a hole about 3 feet deep and 2 feet square. At the bottom of the hole, Cole could see the corner of what looked like a wooden crate. His father's hiding place, finally discovered after nearly 40 years, but someone else had found it first. Cole dropped into the hole and examined the crate more closely. It was made of heavy wood, military surplus by the look of it, with rope handles and metal corner reinforcements. The lid had been pried open, revealing empty interior lined with what had once been oiled cloth. Whatever his father had hidden here was gone. Cole's heart sank as he realized the implications. The Nazis, or their descendants, had already recovered. Whatever James Mathers had died protecting, all of Cole's searching, all the clues and artifacts, had led him to an empty box. But as he started to climb out of the hole, his flashlight beam caught something the previous searchers had missed. Carved into the wooden bottom of the crate, almost invisible, unless viewed from the right angle, were symbols that looked like they might be some kind of code. Cole traced the markings with his finger, trying to make sense of the pattern. They weren't letters or numbers, but geometric shapes arranged in what seemed like a deliberate sequence. A triangle pointing up, a circle with a line through it, a square with an X inside, and finally what looked like an arrow pointing toward the back wall of the cellar. It took Cole several minutes of searching before he found what the arrow was indicating. Hidden behind one of the stone shelves was a loose brick, carefully mortared back into place, but not quite flush with the surrounding wall. When Cole pried it free, he found a hollow space containing a single item that made his breath catch in. His throat. It was a surveyor's compass, similar to the one Martha had given him, but much older and more ornate. The brass casing was engraved with intricate patterns, and when Cole opened it, he could see that this one hadn't been modified. It pointed to true magnetic north, but it was the engraving on the inside of the lid that made Cole's hands tremble. To James, from your loving father, Christmas 1925, may you always find your way home. This compass had belonged to his grandfather, passed down to his father, and now discovered by Cole. 3 generations of Mathers men, each carrying the same instrument through their own struggles and journeys. More importantly, there was a piece of paper wrapped around the compass, protected by the same oiled cloth that had lined the crate. When Cole unfolded it carefully, he found another section of the hand-drawn map, larger and more detailed than the fragment from the tobacco tin. This section showed the mine entrance and the underground tunnel system, with specific chambers marked and distances noted, but it was the writing along the margin that caught Cole's attention. The truth is deeper than they dug. Follow the water to where it started. Cole studied the map by flashlight, comparing it to his mental image of the property's geography. The mine entrance was clearly marked, as were several side tunnels that extended in different directions. One tunnel, marked with a series of X's, seemed to follow the natural course of the creek that ran along his property's eastern boundary. Follow the water to where it started. The creek had to have a source somewhere up in the mountains, probably a natural spring or underground stream. If his father had hidden something along that watercourse, it would be in a location that wouldn't change over time, unlike human landmarks that could be destroyed or moved. The sound of footsteps outside the cellar made Cole freeze. Someone was approaching, moving carefully, but not with the professional silence of the 3 men who'd been searching his property. This was someone else. Someone who seemed to be trying to avoid detection just as much as Cole was. Cole switched off his flashlight and pressed himself against the back wall of the cellar, listening to the footsteps circle the entrance. Whiskey, who had been patiently waiting outside, gave a soft whine of recognition rather than a warning growl. "Cole?" The voice was female, barely above a whisper. "Cole Mathers? Are you in there?" Cole didn't recognize the voice, but Whiskey's reaction suggested this wasn't one of the hostile strangers. Still, after everything that had happened, he wasn't taking any chances. "Who's asking?" he called softly. "My name is Annie Reeves. I'm a historian from the university in Missoula. Martha Brennan sent me to find you." Cole considered his options. Martha had proven trustworthy so far, and if she'd sent someone to help, he needed all the allies he could get. But approaching strangers in the dark rarely ended well. "How do I know Martha sent you? She said to tell you that your father's letters mentioned a key. She said you'd understand what that meant. That was information only Martha possessed." Cole emerged from the cellar cautiously, his flashlight beam revealing a woman in her late 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wore hiking clothes and carried a backpack that suggested she'd come prepared for a serious conversation. "Where's Martha?" Cole asked. "Back in town, keeping watch. She sent me because I have information you need. Information about what your father was really involved in." Annie glanced around nervously. "But we can't talk here. There are men with surveillance equipment watching your house." "I know. I've been avoiding them." "Then you know we're running out of time. They're not just treasure hunters, Cole. They're part of something much bigger, much more dangerous." Annie led him away from the homestead, following game trails that wound through the forest toward higher ground. As they walked, she began to explain why she'd come looking for him. "I've been researching Nazi activities in the American West for my doctoral dissertation. There's been persistent evidence of war criminals who escaped justice after 1945, people who came to places like Montana to hide and wait for things to cool down in Europe. My father's letters mentioned Nazi treasure. It's more than treasure. Coal. During the war, the SS systematically looted occupied territories, not just gold and jewelry, but art, historical artifacts, religious items. Millions of dollars worth of stolen goods that were supposed to be returned to their rightful owners after the war. They reached a rocky outcropping that provided a clear view of the valley below. Cole could see lights moving around his homestead. The 3 searchers were still active, still hunting for whatever his father had hidden. Some of that loot ended up here, Annie continued, smuggled in by Nazi sympathizers, hidden in places like abandoned mines where it could wait for the war to end. The plan was to use the stolen goods to finance a Fourth Reich, to rebuild Nazi power from hiding places around the world. Cole showed her the compass and the map section he'd found in the cellar. Annie examined them with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to historical artifacts. "This is incredible," she breathed. "Do you realize what this represents? Direct evidence of a Nazi conspiracy that most historians thought was just a conspiracy theory. My father died trying to expose this. The question is, why should I finish what he started? Why not just walk away and let sleeping dogs lie?" Annie's expression grew serious. "Because they're not sleeping, Cole. The organization your father was fighting, it never went away. It adapted, evolved, found new ways to operate. Some of the people down there searching your property, they're not just treasure hunters. They're members of neo-Nazi groups that have been waiting decades for a chance to recover their predecessors' stolen goods." The weight of responsibility was crushing. Cole had come to Montana looking for redemption and closure, hoping to learn something about his father and maybe find a place to call home. Instead, he'd inherited a war that had been going on for almost 80 years. "What do you think I should do? What your father couldn't finish? Find the evidence, expose the conspiracy, make sure the stolen goods get returned to their rightful owners or proper museums." Annie pulled out a folder from her backpack. "I've brought copies of everything I've researched about Nazi activities in this area, names, dates, connections to modern organizations. With what you've found and what I've documented, we might have enough to interest the FBI." Cole studied the documents Annie had brought, cross-referencing them with his father's map fragments. The pattern that emerged was both fascinating and terrifying. The Nazi conspiracy in Montana had been extensive, involving dozens of people and multiple hidden storage sites. His property was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, but it might be the most important piece. "The compass your father left," Annie said, examining the antique instrument more closely. "It's pointing somewhere." "Specific, isn't it?" Cole nodded, pulling out the modified compass Martha had given him. Both instruments pointed in the same general direction, northwest, toward the mine entrance and beyond. "I think there's another cache," Cole said. "Somewhere up the mountain, following the creek to its source. My father's map mentions following the water to where it started." Annie smiled for the first time since they'd met. "Then that's where we need to go. But not tonight, and not alone. We need backup, people we can trust." Martha mentioned Sheriff Daniels. "His father was working with mine." "That's a start, but we need to be careful about who we involve. Some of the families in this area have connections that go back generations. We can't be sure who might have divided loyalties." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of vehicles approaching reached them from the valley below, multiple engines moving fast along the access road toward Cole's property. Through the darkness, they could see headlights, more than just the original. "3 searchers." "Reinforcements," Annie said grimly. "They're escalating." Cole made his decision in that moment. He could run, leave Montana, and try to build a quiet life somewhere else. Or he could stay and fight for the truth his father had died protecting. The compass seemed to pulse in his hand, its antique brass warm against his palm. 3 generations of Mather's men had carried instruments like this, using them to find their way through difficult terrain and dangerous situations. Now it was Cole's turn to follow the compass home, not to safety, but to whatever destiny awaited him in the Montana mountains. The reinforcements brought the total count to at least 8 vehicles, their headlights creating a constellation of light around Cole's homestead. From their vantage point on the rocky outcropping, Cole and Annie could see men moving with military precision, establishing a perimeter and setting up what looked like a command post. "They're not just searching anymore," Annie observed grimly. "They're occupying." Cole studied the deployment through a small pair of binoculars Annie had brought. The men were well-equipped and professionally trained, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes from the property. This wasn't a treasure-hunting expedition. It was a military operation. "We need to move," Cole said. "They'll start expanding their search area soon." They worked their way higher into the mountains, following deer trails and staying well away from any routes that could be accessed by vehicles. Whiskey proved invaluable as a scout, ranging ahead to check for dangers and always returning to guide them around obstacles. By midnight, they'd reached a natural shelter formed by an overhang of granite about 2 miles from the homestead. It wasn't comfortable, but it was defensible and hidden from casual observation. "Tell me about the prisoner of war camp," Cole said as they settled in for what remained of the night. "The one Martha mentioned." Annie pulled out a thick folder from her backpack, using a red-filtered flashlight to illuminate the documents. Camp Fortitude. It was one of dozens of POW facilities scattered across the American West during the war. Officially, it housed about 500 German prisoners captured in North Africa and Italy. She showed him photographs from the 1940s, rows of barracks surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and groups of men in prison uniforms working in agricultural fields. Unofficially, Camp Fortitude was special. It housed what the Army called high-value prisoners, SS officers, intelligence operatives, technical specialists, people who knew things the Allied intelligence services wanted to learn, or people who knew where things were hidden, Cole added. "Exactly, and here's where it gets interesting." Annie pulled out a personnel roster, typewritten on official letterhead. "Look at this list of prisoners transferred to Camp Fortitude in late 1943. Cole scanned the names, most of them German surnames he couldn't pronounce. But one name made him stop cold. Oberfuhrer Karl Wagner, Transferred from Camp Crossville, Tennessee, December 15th, 1943. Wagner, Cole breathed. That's the name on the termination order for my father. The same man. Wagner wasn't just any SS officer. He was part of the Unearthed, the organization responsible for looting cultural artifacts from occupied territories. He knew where millions of dollars worth of stolen goods were hidden across Europe. Annie showed him more documents, including intelligence reports that painted a chilling picture. Wagner had been brought to Montana not just as a prisoner, but as a consultant. The US government had been trying to recover Nazi loot, and Wagner had been offering to trade information for better treatment and eventual freedom. The mining operations were a cover, Annie explained. Wagner was directing American soldiers and civilian contractors to specific locations where Nazi treasure had been hidden. The plan was to recover everything and return it to the proper owners after the war. But something went wrong. Wagner was playing a double game. He was giving the Americans some information, but keeping the most valuable caches for himself. He had people on the outside, Nazi sympathizers, collaborators, even some American officials who'd been bought or coerced. Cole studied a map that showed the locations of various mining claims around Bitterroot County. Red X's marked sites where treasure had been recovered, while blue X's showed locations where searches had come up empty. My father's property is marked in blue, he noticed. According to official records, nothing was found there. But I think Wagner lied about that location, told the Americans it was empty while secretly planning to return for it himself. And my father figured out what was really going on, Annie nodded. Your father, Sheriff Daniel's father, and Martha's cousin David. They were the civilian contractors working with Wagner, trusted to help with the recovery operations. But they started noticing inconsistencies, realized Wagner was holding back information. She showed Cole a photograph that made his blood run cold. It was taken at the POW camp in 1944, showing a group of American officials meeting with German prisoners. Cole recognized his father's face immediately, but it was the man standing next to James Mathers that made his heart race. The prisoner was elderly, but still imposing, with the kind of cold intelligence that seemed to radiate from his eyes, even in a decades-old photograph. The caption identified him as Oberfuhrer K. Wagner, Special Consultant, Operation Bernhard Recovery. He's still alive, Cole said, though he wasn't sure how he knew. Wagner. He'd be over 90 now if he survived the war. The old German. I saw at my property. The way he carried himself, the authority in his voice. I think it was him. Annie's face went pale. If Wagner is still alive, if he's still actively trying to recover the treasure he helped hide, then this is much more serious than we thought. He's had almost 80 years to build connections, recruit followers, establish an organization. They spent the rest of the night going through Annie's research, piecing together a conspiracy that stretched from 1940s Montana to modern neo-Nazi movements around the world. The treasure hidden in places like Cole's property wasn't just valuable. It was funding for ongoing operations designed to preserve and spread Nazi ideology. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, Cole made a decision that would change everything. "Oh, we're going to follow the creek," he announced. "Whatever my father hid up there, we're going to find it before Wagner and his people do." Annie looked skeptical. "Just the two of us? Against what looks like a small army of professional operatives? We have advantages they don't. We know the terrain, we have my father's maps, and they think we're running away instead of moving toward the target." Cole pulled out both compasses, the modified one and his grandfather's antique. Both pointed in the same general direction, northwest toward higher ground. "Follow the water to where it started," Cole repeated his father's cryptic instruction. "The creek has to have a source somewhere up in the mountains. If my father hid something along that route, it's been waiting 40 years for someone to find it." They broke camp as the sun cleared the peaks, working their way along game trails that roughly paralleled the creek's course. Whiskey seemed to understand the importance of stealth, moving silently through the forest and alerting them to potential dangers with subtle signals. The creek wound through increasingly rugged terrain, fed by smaller streams and springs as they gained elevation. The water was crystal clear and cold, flowing over granite bedrock that had been carved by thousands of years of erosion. About 3 miles up from Cole's property, they found something that made them both stop in amazement, carved into a granite. Boulder beside the creek was a symbol that matched one of the geometric shapes from Cole's father's code. It was subtle, almost invisible unless viewed from the right angle, but definitely man-made. A trail marker, Annie breathed. Your father left breadcrumbs. They found 2 more markers over the next mile, each one carved into stone or blazed, into tree bark in ways that would survive decades of weather and growth. James Mathers had been methodical, creating a trail that his son could follow even 40 years later. The final marker led them to something extraordinary, hidden behind a screen of pine trees and accessible only by following the creek through a narrow canyon was a natural cave system. The entrance was barely visible, concealed by fallen rocks and vegetation, but clearly artificial in its arrangement. Inside the first chamber, their flashlights revealed something that took Cole's breath away. Wooden crates, dozens of them stacked along the walls and covered with tarps that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. Each crate was marked with German military stencils and inventory numbers that suggested professional organization. But it was the item sitting on top of the nearest crate that made Cole's hands shake. A German prisoner of war identification disc, stamped with a number and the name Wagner Karl, Oberführer SS. Cole picked up the dog tag with trembling fingers, studying the worn metal and faded stamping. This wasn't just evidence of Nazi presence in the mountains. It was proof that Wagner himself had been here, had personally overseen the hiding of whatever treasures these crates contained. Cole. Annie's voice was tight with excitement and fear. You need to see this. She was standing beside an open crate, her flashlight illuminating contents that made both of them gasp in astonishment. Gold bars, jewelry, religious artifacts and works of art that belonged in museums. Millions of dollars worth of items that had been stolen from Jewish families, churches, and cultural institutions across Nazi-occupied Europe. My God, Annie whispered. It's all here. Everything Wagner and his people stole, everything they were planning to use to rebuild their movement. Cole walked among the crates, opening each one to reveal similar treasures. This wasn't just a storage cache, it was a repository of evidence that could expose Nazi war crimes and return stolen goods to their rightful owners or appropriate memorial institutions. But as he explored deeper into the cave system, Cole discovered something that changed everything. In the back chamber, protected by a heavy wooden door that had been recently forced open, was Wagner's personal archive. Documents, photographs, and most importantly, a ledger that detailed every aspect of the Nazi treasure operation. Names of collaborators, locations of other caches, financial records showing how stolen goods had been used to fund neo-Nazi organizations around the world. It was a complete roadmap of a conspiracy that stretched from 1940s Europe to modern-day America. And written on the first page, in Wagner's own handwriting, was a message that made Cole's blood run cold. The Reich will rise again, funded by the heritage of our enemies. What they lost in war, we will reclaim in peace. The treasure of Bitterroot County is merely the beginning. The ledger was dated just 3 months ago. Wagner hadn't just survived the war, he'd been actively using the hidden treasure to fund modern Nazi operations. The conspiracy Cole's father had died fighting was alive, well, and more dangerous than ever. As Cole absorbed the implications of what they'd discovered, Whiskey began growling softly from the cave entrance. Someone was approaching, moving through the forest with the kind of professional stealth that suggested military training. Wagner had found them. The final confrontation was about to begin, and Cole realized that everything, his father's sacrifice, His own search for redemption, the fate of millions of dollars in stolen Nazi treasure, would be decided in the next few minutes. He grabbed his grandfather's compass, checking its heading one more time. The needle pointed steadily toward true north, toward home, toward the truth that 3 generations of Mather's men had been seeking. It was time to finish what his father had started. The footsteps approaching through the forest were too organized to be random hikers, but they lacked the aggressive advance Cole expected from Wagner's men. Whiskey's growl had shifted to something closer to a whine of confusion, as if the dog couldn't decide whether the approaching presence was friend or foe. Cole positioned himself at the cave entrance, ready to defend the treasure cache if necessary. Annie gathered up the most important documents from Wagner's archive, preparing for a potential retreat deeper into the cave system. Cole Mathers! The voice that called out was American, authoritative, but not hostile. "This is Sheriff Samuel. Daniels, I'm coming in alone and I'm here to help." Cole exchanged glances with Annie. This was the moment of truth. Was the sheriff's son an ally like his father had been? Or had the decades changed the family's loyalties? "How do I know you're alone?" Cole called back. "Because if I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead. I've been tracking you for the last 6 hours, and I could have called in Wagner's people at any point." A single figure emerged from the tree line, hands visible and empty. Sheriff Daniels was a man in his late 50s, tall and lean like his father had been in the old photographs, but it was what he carried that made Cole lower his guard, a leather satchel that looked remarkably similar to the one Cole had found at the mine entrance. "Your father and mine were partners," Daniel said as he approached the cave. "They died trying to protect what you've just found." He entered the cave slowly, his eyes adjusting to the dim light before taking in the scope of what Cole and Annie had discovered. "Jesus Christ," he breathed. "It's all here. Everything Wagner stole, everything my father died trying to keep out of Nazi hands." "Your father died?" Cole asked. 3 days after your father disappeared. Official cause was a hunting accident, but there were no witnesses, and his rifle was never found." Daniel set down his satchel and opened it carefully. "But he left me this before he died. Told me to keep it safe until James Mather's son came looking for answers." Inside the satchel was a thick manila envelope, sealed and marked with Cole's full name in his father's handwriting. Beside it was something that made Cole's heart stop. A letter addressed to him personally. "My son," the letter began in James. Mather's careful script. "If you are reading this, it means I am dead, and the conspiracy we've been fighting has claimed another victim. But it also means you found the courage to follow the trail I left behind." Cole's hand shook as he continued, reading by flashlight. "I need you to know the truth about what we discovered here and why I had to die protecting it. Karl Wagner and his Nazi collaborators didn't just steal treasure from occupied Europe. They stole something far more valuable, the location of every major Jewish community's hidden assets, every resistance group's emergency funds, every cultural institution's protected artifacts." The letter went on to detail a conspiracy that was breathtaking in its scope. Wagner hadn't just been a treasure hunter. He'd been a systematic destroyer of cultural heritage, stealing not just valuable objects, but the historical memory they represented. "The treasure in this cave isn't just gold and jewelry, son. It's the preserved heritage of communities that Hitler tried to erase from history. Every item here represents lives lost, families destroyed, cultures nearly eliminated. If Wagner and his followers recover this treasure, they'll sell it to fund operations designed to finish what the Holocaust started." Cole looked up from the letter, seeing the cave contents in an entirely new light. These weren't just valuable objects, they were memorial artifacts, the preserved memory of genocide. "There's more," Sheriff Daniels said quietly. "Your father wasn't just a civilian contractor. He was working undercover for the U.S. government, part of a special task force designed to track down war criminals and recover stolen goods." He pulled out an official document from his satchel, a commission signed by the Secretary of War authorizing James Mathers to conduct special operations in support of denazification efforts. Agent James Mathers, Cole read aloud. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special War Crimes Division. Your father was a federal agent, Daniels confirmed. So was mine. They volunteered for the most dangerous assignment of their careers, infiltrating Wagner's operation and gathering evidence that could be used to prosecute Nazi war criminals. Annie had been examining Wagner's archive while Cole processed this revelation. Now she looked up with an expression of amazement and horror. Cole, you need to see this. Wagner's ledger doesn't just detail past operations, it outlines future plans, operations that are supposed to begin next month. She showed him pages of handwritten notes detailing a network of neo-Nazi cells across the American West, all of them funded by treasure recovered from hiding places like this cave. But it was the final entry that made Cole's blood run cold. Phase 3. Recovery complete. Financing secured. Activation of Homeland cells scheduled for October 15th. Target locations include synagogues, museums, and cultural centers in major cities. Estimated casualties, 501,000 per location. The date was less than 2 months away. They're planning terrorist attacks, Cole said, the magnitude of the conspiracy finally hitting him. Multiple locations, coordinated strikes designed to reignite racial hatred and religious persecution. Sheriff Daniels nodded grimly. And they need the treasure from this cave to fund the operation. That's why Wagner came out of hiding after all these years. That's why they've been so desperate to find what your father hid. Cole continued reading his father's letter, searching for guidance about what to do next. If you're reading this, son, it means I failed to stop them the first time. But you have something I didn't have. You have the complete archive, the evidence needed to expose the entire conspiracy. Take Wagner's documents to the FBI, to the press, to anyone who will listen. Make sure the world knows what these people are planning. But it was the final paragraph that revealed the twist Cole never saw coming. There's something else you need to know, something I couldn't tell your mother because it would have put you both in danger. Wagner wasn't just the leader of the treasure operation. He was my handler. I wasn't investigating him from the outside. I was his trusted lieutenant, one of his inner circle. Everything I learned, every piece of evidence I gathered, came from months of earning his trust and pretending to support his cause. Cole stared at the letter in shock. His father hadn't just been fighting the Nazi conspiracy. He'd been part of it, at least on the surface. The ultimate undercover operation. I know what you must be thinking, the letter continued, but sometimes the only way to defeat evil is to get close enough to understand it completely. I spent 2 years pretending to be a Nazi sympathizer, attending their meetings, participating in their planning, earning Wagner's complete trust. Sheriff Daniels confirmed what the letter revealed. Your father was the deepest undercover operative in U.S. history. He convinced Wagner that he was a true believer, someone who could be trusted with the location of the most valuable treasure caches. But something went wrong, Cole realized. Wagner figured out that your father was documenting everything, photographing documents, copying maps. When Wagner ordered your father's execution, it wasn't just to silence a witness. It was to eliminate a federal agent who'd gathered enough evidence to destroy the entire operation. Annie had found something else in Wagner's archive, a photograph that made everything fall into place. It showed Wagner and James Mathers together, both men smiling as they stood beside open treasure caches. To anyone looking at the picture, they appeared to be partners, collaborators in the theft of Nazi treasure. This is what they would have used to discredit your father, she explained. If he'd survived to testify, Wagner would have claimed that James Mathers was actually his American partner, that any evidence your father presented was just an attempt to shift blame after the conspiracy was exposed. Cole understood now why. His father had never been able to simply turn Wagner into the authorities. The evidence that proved Wagner's guilt also implicated James Mathers as a collaborator. Without the complete context, without proof of the undercover operation, his father would have appeared to be just another Nazi war criminal. So he hid the evidence instead, Cole said, waited for the right moment to expose everything at once. A moment that never came, Daniels replied, because Wagner had him killed before he could complete the mission. Cole folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket alongside the compasses and map fragments. The weight of responsibility was crushing, but also clarifying. He finally understood what his father had died trying to accomplish. "We have everything we need," he announced. "Wagner's archive, my father's evidence, testimony from witnesses who knew the truth. We can expose the whole conspiracy, stop the terrorist attacks, and make sure this treasure gets returned to the right people." But even as he spoke, Cole could hear vehicles approaching through the forest. Wagner had found them, and this time, he'd brought enough firepower to finish what he'd started 40 years ago. "How long do we have?" Annie asked. Sheriff Daniels checked his radio, listening to chatter from his deputies, who were monitoring the situation from a distance. "Maybe 10 minutes before they reach the cave entrance. But we have one advantage they don't know about." "What's that?" Daniels smiled grimly. "I didn't come here alone either. I brought friends, federal agents who've been waiting 40 years for a chance to close this case." The final confrontation was about to begin, but now Cole understood the stakes. This wasn't just about treasure or personal revenge. It was about preventing the rise of a Fourth Reich, funded by the stolen heritage of Holocaust victims. His father had died a hero, and now it was Cole's turn to finish the mission. "Sheriff." Daniels pulled out a tactical radio and spoke in code that sounded like standard law enforcement communication, but carried undertones that suggested something far more sophisticated. "Eagle Base, this is Ranger 1. Package located and secured. Request immediate extraction and full tactical support." The response came back in a voice Cole didn't recognize. "Ranger 1, this is Eagle Base. Tactical teams are in position. Estimated. Time to contact 8 minutes. Hold your position and protect the assets." Cole looked at Daniels with new understanding. "You're not just the local sheriff." "Haven't been for 20 years, Daniels confirmed. "FBI Counterintelligence Division, assigned to monitor neo-Nazi activities in the Mountain West. When your name showed up in property records for this land, it triggered alerts that went all the way to Washington." Annie was photographing pages from Wagner's archive with professional speed, using a high-resolution camera that suggested she was more than just an academic historian. "Let me guess," Cole said. "You're not really writing a dissertation." "Holocaust documentation project funded by the Simon Wiesenthal Center," Annie replied, without looking up from her work. "I've been tracking Wagner's network for 3 years, but we could never get close enough to gather actionable intelligence." Cole realized he'd been the key to a decades-long investigation, the unwitting catalyst that had finally brought all the players into the open. "How long have you known?" he asked Daniels. "Known what? That you were James Mathers' son?" "Since the day you were born. The FBI has been keeping loose tabs on you your whole life, waiting to see if you'd ever try to find answers about your father. And when I got out of prison and started researching property records, we knew Wagner would eventually make contact. He's been monitoring the same databases, waiting for any sign that James Mathers had family who might come looking for his legacy." The sound of vehicles was getting closer, multiple engines moving through the forest with the confidence of people who knew exactly where they were going. "How many are we dealing with?" Cole asked. Daniels checked his tactical display. "Wagner brought 12 operatives, all with military training, but we have 16 federal agents surrounding this area, plus air support and a specialized recovery team for the artifacts. This has been planned for a while. 40 years, Cole. Ever since your father was killed, the FBI has been waiting for an opportunity to catch Wagner in the act of trying to recover Nazi treasure on American soil. We needed him to expose himself, to bring his network into the open where we could identify and arrest everyone involved." Cole felt a mixture of anger and admiration. He'd been used as bait, his personal quest for answers turned into a federal operation. But he also understood the necessity. Wagner's conspiracy had to be stopped, and sometimes the only way to catch a ghost was to give him something he desperately wanted to chase. Annie finished photographing the most critical documents and began packing the originals into a waterproof case. "The important thing now is making sure this evidence survives the next hour," she said. "Wagner will try to destroy everything rather than let it fall into federal hands." Daniels was studying a hand-drawn tactical map that Cole recognized as his father's work. The same careful draftsmanship that had characterized the treasure maps now applied to defensive positions around the cave entrance. "Your father knew this day would come," Daniels explained. "He mapped out defensive positions, escape routes, places where a small force could hold off a larger group long enough for help to arrive." Cole examined the map, recognizing landmarks. Around the cave system, his father had turned the entire area into a fortress, using natural choke points and concealed positions to maximum advantage. He was planning to make a stand here, until Wagner had him killed first, but James left detailed instructions for anyone who found this place, anyone who needed to defend it against the same enemies he'd been fighting. The sound of approaching footsteps was now close enough to distinguish individual movements. Cole counted at least 8 people moving through the forest, spreading out to surround the cave entrance. "Wagner's not going to negotiate," Cole said, remembering the cold calculation. "In the old German's eyes, no," Daniels agreed. "He's spent 80 years building toward this moment. He'll kill anyone who gets between him and this treasure, then use the gold to fund terrorist attacks that could kill thousands of people." Annie had finished packing the documents and was now helping Cole move the most valuable artifacts to a secure location, deeper in the cave. But it was one particular item that caught Cole's attention. A ornate sword in a leather scabbard, clearly of German military origin, but with decorations that suggested high rank. "That's Wagner's ceremonial sword," Annie explained when she saw Cole examining it. "SS officers carried them as symbols of authority. He must have left it here when he was originally hiding the treasure, planning to recover it along with everything else." Cole drew the sword partially from its scabbard, revealing a blade that was still sharp after decades of storage. Engraved along the fuller were symbols that made his stomach turn: Nazi eagles, SS lightning bolts, and runic inscriptions that celebrated racial superiority. "A weapon of oppression," he said quietly, "but also evidence," Annie pointed out. "Wagner's personal effects, items that can be used to prove his identity and connect him to specific war crimes." The first gunshot echoed through the canyon, followed immediately by the sharp crack of return fire. The federal agents surrounding the area had engaged Wagner's operatives, beginning a firefight that would determine the fate of everyone involved. Daniels spoke urgently into his radio. "Eagle Base, contact initiated. Request immediate air support and medical evacuation capability. Ranger 1, air support is 3 minutes out. Hold your position and protect the primary asset." Cole realized he was the primary asset, the son of James Mathers, the key witness who could testify about everything they'd discovered. His survival had become the most important objective of the entire operation. But Cole had different priorities. "I'm not hiding in a cave while other people fight my father's war," he announced, checking the action on an old rifle they'd found among the stored equipment. "Cole, you're too important to risk in combat," Daniels protested. "The testimony you can provide, the evidence you've seen, it's worth more than anything you could accomplish with a gun. My father spent 2 years undercover, risking his life every day to gather evidence against these people. The least I can do is help make sure that evidence reaches the right authorities." Annie grabbed his arm as he headed toward the cave entrance. "This isn't about proving yourself, Cole. This is about survival, about making sure Wagner's conspiracy gets exposed. Then help me survive long enough to do it." The gunfire was intensifying, moving closer to the cave entrance as Wagner's people pushed forward despite the federal agents' defensive positions. Through the trees, Cole could see muzzle flashes and the shadows of figures moving with tactical precision. Daniels made a decision that surprised everyone. "All right, if we're making a stand, we do it right." He pulled out a detailed tactical plan that bore his father's signature. William Daniels and James Mathers planned for this exact scenario. They knew Wagner would eventually come for this treasure, and they prepared accordingly. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. The cave system had multiple entrances, most of them hidden and accessible only to people who knew the terrain intimately. By using these concealed routes, a small force could appear to be much larger, creating crossfires and flanking maneuvers that would confuse and demoralize attackers. "Your father wasn't just an undercover agent," Daniels explained as they prepared their defenses. "He was also a decorated combat veteran, someone who understood how to turn disadvantage into victory." Cole felt a surge of pride that mixed with his determination. James Mathers had been a hero in every sense of the word, a federal agent, a combat veteran, and a father who died trying to protect his son's future. Now it was time for the son. To honor that legacy, the sound of helicopter rotors echoed through the canyon as federal air support arrived, their searchlights cutting through the forest canopy to illuminate Wagner's operatives. But the old German was too experienced to be caught easily. His people had already taken cover and were returning fire with professional discipline. Wagner's not just a treasure hunter, Cole realized. He's still a military commander, isn't he? Oberfuhrer Karl Wagner, former commanding officer of SS Special Operations Division, Annie confirmed. He's been training neo-Nazi militants for decades, preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. The final battle was about to begin. Federal agents against neo-Nazi terrorists, the stolen heritage of Holocaust victims at stake, and Cole, thus standing in the same position his father had occupied 40 years earlier. But this time, Cole had advantages his father hadn't possessed. He had federal backup, he had evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy, and he had the knowledge that he was fighting not just for treasure, but for the memory of every victim of Nazi persecution. Whiskey appeared beside him as if summoned. By the approaching danger, the old cattle dog's instincts sharp despite his age. Together, they would defend what James Mathers had died protecting. The compass in Cole's pocket pointed steadily toward true north, toward justice, toward the completion of a mission that had been 40 years in the making. Wagner's voice carried across the canyon, speaking in accented English that commanded attention despite the gunfire around them. "James Mathers, son, I know you can hear me. Your father was a fool who died for nothing. Give me what belongs to me, and I'll let you live to bury him properly." Cole stepped to the cave entrance, making himself visible to the federal agents. "And Wagner's operatives alike. My father died protecting the heritage of people you tried to destroy," he called back. "The only thing you're going to get from me is justice." The final confrontation had begun. Wagner's response came in the form of concentrated gunfire that chipped granite from the cave entrance and sent Cole diving for cover. The old Nazi might be over 90, but his tactical instincts remained sharp. As a blade, suppressive fire advanced by bounds. Wagner's command carried clearly over the gunfire, delivered in the kind of voice that had once ordered the deaths of thousands. His operatives moved with military precision, using covering fire, and coordinated advances that spoke of extensive training. Cole found himself crouched behind a granite outcropping, with whiskey pressed against his leg, the old dog's breathing steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The rifle he'd found felt familiar in his hands, muscle memory from his younger days when hunting had been necessity rather than sport. Sheriff Daniels appeared beside him, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to combat situations. "Federal teams have Wagner's people pinned down in 3 locations," Daniels reported, speaking directly into Cole's ear to be heard over the gunfire. But he's got professional operators, probably ex-military contractors. This isn't going to be easy. Through gaps in the rock cover, Cole could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions scattered through the forest below. Wagner had deployed his people with the expertise of someone who'd spent decades planning for exactly this confrontation. He's been preparing for this moment for 40 years, Cole realized. Recruiting, training, positioning assets. This isn't just about recovering treasure. It's about proving that his ideology can still win. Annie appeared from deeper in the cave system, carrying equipment that looked distinctly non-academic. The communications gear and tactical vest she now wore revealed her true profession more clearly than any credentials. Federal command wants us to hold position until air support can neutralize the hostile positions, she reported. But Wagner's people have shoulder-fired missiles. They've already driven off 1 helicopter. The sound of an explosion from somewhere down the canyon confirmed her words. Wagner had come prepared for a military-level confrontation, armed with weapons that could challenge even federal tactical teams. Cole studied his father's defensive map, comparing it to what he could observe of the current battle. James Mathers had anticipated this exact scenario, planning for the day when Wagner would bring superior numbers and firepower to recover his hidden treasure. "There's a flanking route," Cole announced, tracing a path on the map that led through the cave system and emerged behind Wagner's main position. "My father mapped out every approach, every defensive option." "Too dangerous," Daniel said immediately. "Wagner's people will have positioned security along any obvious flanking routes. Not if they don't know the route exists." Cole showed them a passage marked on his father's map that wasn't visible from the cave's main chamber. Hidden behind what appeared to be solid rock was an opening just large enough for a person to crawl through, leading to a network of natural tunnels that emerged hundreds of yards away. James spent months exploring these caves, Cole explained. He knew Wagner would eventually bring superior firepower, so he created options for mobility that couldn't be detected or countered. The sound of automatic weapons fire intensified as federal agents attempted to advance on Wagner's positions, only to be driven back by concentrated defensive fire. The old Nazi had chosen his ground well, using natural cover and overlapping fields of fire to maximum advantage. "We're at a stalemate," Annie observed. "Wagner's people can't advance without exposing themselves to federal snipers, but they can hold their positions indefinitely, unless someone gets behind them," Cole said. Daniel shook his head. "I can't authorize a civilian to undertake that kind of tactical maneuver. You're too important as a witness. Then don't authorize it, just don't stop me." Cole gathered essential equipment, the rifle, extra ammunition, a tactical flashlight, and most importantly, Wagner's ceremonial sword. If he was going to confront the architect of his father's death, he wanted to do it with a weapon that carried symbolic weight. Whiskey followed him toward the hidden passage, the old dog's instincts alert to the importance of their mission. Together, they disappeared into darkness that had remained undisturbed since James Mathers had first explored these tunnels 40 years ago. The passage was narrower than Cole had expected, requiring him to crawl through sections where the rock ceiling pressed down claustrophobically. But his father's map was accurate, marking every obstacle and indicating the safest route through the underground maze. 20 minutes later, Cole emerged from a concealed opening about 300 yards behind Wagner's main defensive position. The sound of gunfire was muffled by distance and intervening terrain, but he could see the tactical situation clearly. Wagner had positioned his operatives in a rough semicircle, using natural cover to create overlapping defensive sectors. It was a textbook defensive deployment, designed to repel frontal assault while maintaining communication and mutual support. But Wagner himself wasn't with his operatives. Cole spotted the old Nazi standing alone on a rocky prominence about 50 yards from his main defensive line, using binoculars to observe the federal positions while speaking into a tactical radio. Even at 90-plus years old, Wagner moved with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. This was Cole's chance, possibly his only chance, to end the confrontation before more people died. He worked his way through the forest, using his father's map to approach Wagner's position from an unexpected angle. Whiskey followed silently, the old dog's hunting instincts engaged despite his age and the unusual circumstances. The closer Cole got to Wagner, the more he could hear. Of the old Nazis' radio communications, federal response is stronger than anticipated, but still manageable. Continue suppressive fire until the secondary teams can advance on the cave entrance. The treasure must be recovered at any cost. Wagner was coordinating a complex tactical operation, directing not just the operatives Cole could see, but additional forces positioned elsewhere in the canyon. The federal agents were outnumbered and outgunned, facing an enemy who'd had decades to plan for this exact confrontation. Cole reached a position about 30 yards from Wagner's rocky observation post, close enough to hear individual words, but still concealed by pine trees and granite boulders. The old Nazi had his back turned, focused entirely on the tactical situation developing below. Drawing Wagner's ceremonial sword, Cole felt the weight of history in his hands. This weapon had been carried by someone who'd participated in genocide, who'd stolen the heritage of murdered families, who'd spent decades planning to continue his campaign of hatred and destruction. Now it would serve justice instead of oppression. "Oberfuhrer Wagner!" Cole called out, his voice carrying clearly through the mountain air. The old Nazi turned slowly, unsurprised by the interruption, but calculating the threat Cole represented. Even at his advanced age, Wagner radiated the kind of cold intelligence that had made him dangerous for 8 decades. "James Mather's son," Wagner said in accented English that carried traces of aristocratic education. "You look exactly like your father did at your age. Same stubborn jaw, same foolish idealism. You killed him." "I had him eliminated, yes. He was interfering with operations that were vital to the continuation of the Reich." Wagner's voice carried no remorse, only the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing necessary business decisions. "The Reich is dead. You lost the war." Wagner smiled, an expression that was more terrifying than any display of anger could have been. "The Reich never dies, young man. It adapts, it evolves, it waits for opportunities to resurface. Your father understood that, which is why he had to be eliminated." Cole raised the ceremonial sword, its blade catching afternoon sunlight that filtered through the pine canopy. "This belongs to you," he said. "Indeed it does. I'm impressed that you found it, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. Your father was quite thorough in his documentation. He was a federal agent. He was gathering evidence to destroy your organization." Wagner's laugh was genuinely amused. "Evidence? My dear boy, your father was one of my most trusted operatives. Everything he knew about our organization, he learned because I chose to share it with him." The claim hit Cole like a physical blow, despite everything he'd learned about his father's undercover operation. "You're lying." "Am I?" James Mathers participated in the recovery of Reich assets for over 2 years. He attended our planning meetings, assisted with operational security, even helped recruit additional operatives. The only thing that changed was his sudden attack of conscience when he realized the scope of our future operations. Cole felt doubt creeping into his mind, the same doubt that had plagued him since discovering his father's photograph among Nazi documents. He was working undercover. Sheriff Daniels confirmed it. Sheriff Daniels believes what he needs to believe. But tell me, young Mathers, if your father was truly working against us, why didn't he simply report our activities to federal authorities? When he first discovered them, why did he spend 2 years helping us recover stolen assets before suddenly deciding to play hero? The questions were designed to undermine Cole's confidence, to create the kind of moral confusion that Wagner had. Probably used to manipulate people for decades. But Cole remembered his father's letters, remembered the fear and desperation in James Mather's final communications, because he needed evidence that would convince people, because he knew you had connections in the government, people who would protect you if he moved too quickly. Wagner's smile widened. Very good. You understand the complexity of the situation better than most. The sound of gunfire from below was intensifying, suggesting that Wagner's secondary teams were beginning their assault on the federal positions. It doesn't matter now, Wagner continued. Within the next hour, my operatives will recover the Reich assets your father tried to hide, and the financing for our next phase of operations will be secured. What operations? The restoration of proper order, of course. The elimination of degenerate influences, the establishment of racially pure communities, the continuation of work that was interrupted in 1945. Cole realized that Wagner wasn't just talking about terrorist attacks. He was describing a comprehensive plan to revive Nazi ideology in modern America, funded by treasure stolen from Holocaust victims. You won't succeed. The FBI knows about your network, your plans, everything. The FBI knows what I've chosen to reveal, but they don't understand the true scope of what we've built over the past 8 decades. Wagner pulled out a device that looked like a military detonator, holding it where Cole could see it clearly. The cave containing the Reich assets is rigged with explosives, young Mathers. If I cannot recover the treasure, I will ensure that no one else can either. The heritage of our enemies will be destroyed rather than returned to them. The threat was credible and immediate. Wagner would rather destroy millions of dollars in Holocaust artifacts than allow them to be returned to their rightful owners, or placed in memorial institutions. Cole had seconds to act, and the weight of his father's legacy pressed down on him like the mountain itself. Cole's mind raced as he weighed his options. Wagner's finger rested on the detonator, ready to destroy evidence that could expose a network of war criminals and return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. But rushing the old Nazi would likely result in the very outcome Cole was trying. To prevent your bluffing, Cole said, keeping the ceremonial sword raised but not advancing. Am I? Wagner's smile was coldly amused. I've spent 80 years preparing for this moment, young Mathers. Did you really think I would leave anything to chance? The sound of explosions from the valley below suggested that Wagner's secondary teams had begun using heavier weapons against the federal positions. Time was running out for everyone involved. Even if you destroy the cave, the FBI has photographs of everything, Cole pointed out. Annie documented your entire archive. Photographs can be dismissed as fabrications. But the physical artifacts, the items that can be scientifically authenticated and traced to their original owners, those would have been conclusive proof of war crimes that could still be prosecuted. Wagner was right, and they both knew it. Without the physical evidence, the case against his network would be circumstantial, dependent on witness testimony that could be challenged in court. Besides, Wagner continued, the destruction of the artifact serves a symbolic purpose as well. Every item in that cave represents a Jewish family, a destroyed community, a culture that we nearly eradicated. Finishing that work, even posthumously, has its own value. The casual evil in Wagner's voice was breathtaking. Even facing death or capture, the old Nazi remained committed to the genocide he'd helped orchestrate decades earlier. But as Cole listened to Wagner's monologue, he noticed something the old man had missed. Whiskey was no longer beside him. The cattle dog had disappeared into the forest, moving with the kind of stealth that came from years of hunting experience. You want to know the truth about your father? Wagner asked, apparently interpreting Cole's momentary distraction as uncertainty. He was weak, brilliant but weak. He had the intelligence to understand our vision for the future, but lacked the strength to embrace what that future required. And what does your future require? Purity, order, the elimination of degenerate influences that corrupt society and weaken the human species. Wagner's voice carried the fervor of someone who'd spent decades refining his hatred into ideology. Your father helped us recover millions of dollars in assets that will fund the restoration of proper racial hierarchy. Cole felt rage building in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Wagner was trying to provoke him into making a mistake, into rushing forward and triggering the detonation that would destroy the evidence. "The war is over," Cole said quietly. "You lost. Your Reich is dead, and the world has moved beyond your twisted vision." "Has it?" Wagner laughed. "Look around you, young man. Racial tensions, economic inequality, social unrest. The conditions that brought the Reich to power in the first place still exist. All we need is the proper catalyst, the right series of events to awaken the sleeping instincts of the superior races. The terrorist attacks you're planning, coordinated operations, designed to demonstrate the ongoing threat posed by inferior races and degenerate ideologies. When synagogues burn and museums are destroyed, when the symbols of Jewish influence are eliminated, the natural response will be a return to traditional values and racial consciousness." Cole realized that Wagner wasn't just planning random acts of terrorism. He was attempting to engineer a societal response that would recreate the conditions that had allowed Nazism to flourish in 1930s Germany. "You're insane. I'm historically informed. These cycles repeat themselves, Mathers. The Reich rises, faces temporary setbacks, then rises again stronger than before. What died in 1945 was merely one manifestation of eternal principles. A sharp crack from the forest behind Wagner suggested that whiskey had found something worth investigating. The old dog's hunting instincts were still sharp, even if his prey had changed from rabbits to something far more dangerous. Wagner noticed the sound too, turning slightly to scan the tree line behind his position. The movement gave Cole the opening he'd been waiting for, but instead of attacking immediately, Cole made a different choice, one his father would have understood. "Before you trigger that detonator," Cole called out, "there's something you should know about the treasure you've been hunting for 40 years. Wagner paused, his finger still on the detonator, but his attention caught by Cole's words. "What could you possibly know that I don't?" Cole reached into his jacket and pulled out the final item from his father's archive, something he'd kept hidden until this moment. It was a small leather journal, bound with a ribbon and marked with James Mather's initials. "My father kept records of everything you told him, everything you showed him, everyone you trusted him to meet. But more importantly, he kept records of what you didn't tell him, the discrepancies between your stories and the physical evidence." Wagner's expression shifted from confidence to uncertainty for the first time since their confrontation had begun. "You see," Cole continued, "the treasure in that cave? It's not the complete collection you think it is. My father figured out that you'd been lying to the Americans about certain caches, holding back the most valuable items for your own purposes. Impossible. I supervised every recovery operation personally. Did you? Or did you delegate some of the work to trusted subordinates, while you maintained plausible deniability?" Cole opened his father's journal, reading from entries dated 1944. "According to my father's notes, you told the American recovery teams that certain locations were empty when they actually contained the most valuable artifacts. The sound of approaching footsteps through the forest suggested that federal agents were working their way toward Wagner's position, probably following the route Cole had used to outflank the Nazi positions." Wagner's grip on the detonator tightened, but Cole could see doubt creeping into the old man's eyes. "The items in that cave represent maybe 20% of what you originally helped hide," Cole continued. "The rest is still out there, in locations that only you knew about. If you destroy this cache, you'll be eliminating the only clues that could lead to the really valuable collections." "You're lying." "Am I? How else do you think my father convinced your American partners that he was trustworthy? He gave them real intelligence about hidden Nazi assets, information that you provided, thinking he was just another collaborator." Wagner's face was pale now, the implications of Cole's words sinking in. If James Mathers had used Wagner's own information against him, if the old Nazi had unknowingly provided the intelligence that led to the recovery of other treasure caches, then his entire operation had been compromised from the beginning. The FBI recovered over $50 million in Nazi assets during the 1940s, Cole said, pulling numbers from his father's journal. Assets that you told them about, locations you identified, items you thought would buy you lenient treatment. After the war, the sound of automatic weapons fire from the valley was diminishing, suggesting that the federal agents were gaining control of the tactical situation. Wagner's operatives were running out of ammunition, running out of options, running out of time. My father played you, Wagner. For 2 years, he let you think he was your most trusted ally, while he systematically documented every aspect of your network. The undercover operation wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about using your own information against you. Wagner's hand trembled on the detonator, rage and uncertainty warring in his ancient features. Even if that's true, he said finally, destroying this cache still serves our purposes. The artifacts will never be returned to their original owners, never be used to memorialize the people we eliminated. That's where you're wrong. Cole pulled out the item that would change everything, his father's Congressional Medal of Honor, found with the final cache and hidden until this crucial moment. The medal was pristine despite its age, the bronze star suspended from its blue ribbon, catching the afternoon sunlight. Engraved on the back were words that made Wagner's face contort with fury, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against enemies of the United States. This was awarded posthumously to FBI agent James Mathers for his undercover work destroying Nazi networks in occupied territories, Cole explained. He wasn't just investigating your organization, he was systematically dismantling it, one operation at a time. Wagner raised a pistol that Cole hadn't noticed before, his finger moving toward the trigger with the practiced speed of someone who'd killed many people over the course of a very long life. But whiskey emerged from the forest at exactly the right moment, the old cattle dog's hunting instincts perfectly timed. The dog's attack wasn't vicious, he was too old and too gentle for that, but it was precisely targeted, knocking Wagner off balance just as the pistol fired. The shot went wide, and Cole was moving before the echo faded. Wagner's ceremonial sword felt perfectly balanced in his hands as he closed the distance between them, 40 years of injustice and a lifetime of questions driving him forward. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds, but seemed to encompass decades of history. Wagner fought with the desperate strength of someone who'd spent 80 years evading justice, while Cole fought with the focused determination of a son finally able to avenge his father's murder. When it ended, Wagner lay motionless on the granite, outcropping, the detonator fallen from his lifeless fingers. The threat to the treasure cave was over, but more importantly, the architect of James Mathers' death had finally faced justice. Cole picked up his father's Medal of Honor, feeling the weight of 3 generations of service and sacrifice. The day compass in his pocket pointed steadily toward true north, toward home, toward the completion of a mission that had taken 40 years to fulfill. 6 months later, Cole stood in the main room of what had once been a crumbling homestead and was now the James Mathers Memorial Center for Holocaust Education. The walls that had been rotting when he first arrived were now lined with carefully curated displays showing artifacts recovered from Wagner's network, each item accompanied by information about its original owners and historical significance. The transformation had been remarkable. What began as a personal quest for answers had evolved into something far more meaningful, a living memorial that honored not just his father's sacrifice, but the memory of every person whose heritage had been stolen by Nazi persecution. Annie. Approached from the research library they'd established in what used to be the barn, carrying a folder of correspondence that arrived daily from around the world. 3 more families have been contacted about items in the collection, she reported, her academic credentials now serving a purpose far more important than any dissertation. A menorah from Berlin, a wedding ring from Prague, and a set of Sabbath candlesticks from a synagogue in Warsaw. Cole nodded, reviewing the carefully documented provenance of each recovered artifact. The FBI's investigation had led to the discovery of 17 additional cache sites across the Mountain West, recovering over $200 million in stolen Nazi treasure. But the dollar value was insignificant compared to the human stories each item represented. Any word from the Wiesenthal Center about the documentation project? He asked. They want to use our archive as the foundation for a comprehensive database of recovered Nazi loot. It could help reunite thousands of items with their rightful owners or appropriate memorial institutions. Sheriff Daniels, whose real identity as FBI Special Agent Samuel Daniels had been revealed during the investigation, entered carrying the morning mail and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had finally reached a successful conclusion. The last of Wagner's operatives were sentenced yesterday, he announced. 15 to 25 years for conspiracy to commit terrorism, plus additional charges for possession of stolen property and violation of federal hate crime statutes. Cole walked to the window that looked out over the valley where so much history had unfolded. The view was the same as it had been when he first arrived, rolling mountains covered in pine and aspen, the creek running clear and cold along the eastern boundary, but his understanding of what this place represented had changed completely. Any regrets? Annie asked, joining him at the window. Cole considered the question seriously. His original plan had been simple: buy cheap land, fix up a house, maybe find some peace in his later years. Instead, he'd inherited a war that had been going on for 8 decades and found himself responsible for preserving the memory of genocide. About Wagner? No. About the complexity of what we've taken on. Sometimes, the Memorial Center was funded by the recovered Nazi treasure, operating under federal oversight to ensure that every dollar was used appropriately. Cole had kept only enough to restore the homestead itself, dedicating the rest to educational programs and victim assistance. Your father would be proud, Daniels observed, not just of what you accomplished, but of what you've built here. Cole pulled out the compass that had started everything, his grandfather's antique instrument that had guided 3 generations of Mather's men through their various struggles. The needle pointed steadily toward magnetic north, no longer modified to indicate hidden treasure, but serving its original purpose of helping travelers find their way. He left me more than I realized, Cole said. Not just clues about hidden gold, but an example of how to stand up for what's right even when it costs everything. Whiskey appeared at Cole's side, the old cattle dog moving more slowly than he had 6 months ago, but still alert and devoted. The dog had become something of a mascot for the Memorial Center, his instincts for hidden things proving useful when researchers needed to locate additional artifacts Wagner might have concealed. There's something else, Annie said, pulling out a document that bore official federal seals. The president signed the legislation yesterday. The James Mathers Act creates a new federal task force specifically dedicated to tracking down remaining Nazi assets and war criminals. Cole read through the legislation, noting that it allocated significant resources to continuing the work his father had started. The Memorial Center would serve as the headquarters for ongoing investigations, ensuring that Wagner's network was completely dismantled and that any remaining stolen artifacts were recovered and returned. It's not just about the past anymore, he realized. It's about making sure this never happens again. The afternoon mail brought something that made Cole's heart race, a letter addressed to him personally, with a return address from Livingston, Montana, his mother's hometown, the place she'd lived when his father was writing those letters that never got delivered. Inside was a handwritten note from an elderly woman named Sarah Brennan. "Dear Mr. Mathers," the letter began, "I was Martha Brennan's aunt, and I knew your mother Sarah when she lived here during the war. I've been following the news about your father and the memorial center you've established. There are things about your mother that you should know, things she made me promise to tell you if you ever came looking for answers about your father." The letter went on to reveal that Sarah Mathers had known more about her husband's work than she'd ever admitted. She'd been James Mathers' intelligence contact, the person who relayed information between the undercover agent and his federal handlers. Her move away from Livingston after James's death hadn't been coincidental. It had been part of a witness protection program designed to keep both her and her son safe from Wagner's network. "Your mother spent her entire life protecting you from the truth about your father's work," the letter concluded. "But she also spent that time documenting everything she knew about Wagner's organization, keeping records that she hoped would someday help complete your father's mission. Those records are waiting for you if you want them." Cole folded the letter carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket beside his grandfather's compass. Even after everything they'd discovered, after all the loose ends they'd tied up, his family's story still held surprises. "More mysteries?" Annie asked, noticing his expression. "More opportunities," Cole corrected. "My mother kept records too. We might not be finished with this investigation after all." The sun was setting behind the western peaks, painting the valley, in shades of gold and amber that reminded Cole of that first evening when he'd stood on this same spot, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Now he knew. He'd inherited not just property, but responsibility, not just treasure, but truth. The new deed to the property reflected its changed status, no longer the abandoned homestead of a failed homesteader, but the James Mathers Memorial Center, protected in perpetuity as a site of historical significance and educational importance. Cole walked out onto the rebuilt porch where he'd spent so many evenings planning the next phase of their investigation. Whiskey settled beside his chair with a contented sigh, the old dog's hunting days finally over, but his purpose fulfilled. In his pocket, Cole's father's final letter crinkled softly as he shifted position. He'd read it dozens of times over the past 6 months, but one passage still stood out with particular clarity. "The real treasure isn't gold or silver, son. It's the knowledge that you stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves, that you fought for justice even when the odds seemed impossible, that you honored the memory of those who were silenced by evil." Cole opened his grandfather's compass one more time, watching the needles settle toward true north. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more artifacts to catalog, more families to contact, more evidence to preserve for future generations. But tonight, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Cole Mathers felt like he'd found his way home. The Memorial Center would continue its work, ensuring that Wagner's victims were remembered and that the lessons of their persecution were never forgotten. Cole had finally found the redemption he'd been seeking, not through escape or forgetting, but through the completion of his father's most important mission. As the stars appeared over the Montana mountains, Cole began writing his own letter. Not to family he'd never meet, but to future generations who would inherit the responsibility of fighting hatred and preserving truth. The work his father had started would continue, passing from one generation to the next, like the compass that had guided them all toward justice. The past had finally found peace, and the future held the promise of continued vigilance against the kind of evil that Wagner had represented. Cole Mathers had come home at last, not to the place he'd left behind, but to the purpose he'd been born to fulfill.